another episode of Legacy's Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds, the educational series dedicated to providing you with all the info on popular decks, strategies, insight, and more for the Legacy format. I am your host, Zachary Cuck. Today, I am fortunate to bring you all a very accomplished wizard, whose tournament success is overshadowed perhaps only by his rare opportunity to serve an internship at the mothership, Wizards of the Coast R&D. To his name, he has 22 Star City Games Open Top 8s, 5 of which resulted in a win. 6 Star City Games Invitational Top 8s, 2 of which resulted in a win. He has 9 Grand Prix Top 16s, 2 of which resulted in a win, and 1 Pro Tour Top 8. He is a full-time Magic grinder and premium content provider for StarCityGames.com. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Gerry Thompson. Gerry, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's awesome. I was really excited whenever you agreed to come do an interview and help me out with this with my Legacy podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I love Legacy, and I generally like doing podcasts too. So here I am.
Cool. So let's dig in. I asked you to join because you were sort of the if not the creator, at least the mastermind behind developing the Shardless Sultai deck, the archetype and the deck, the deck, the Shardless deck. So why don't you explain to the listeners, what is Shardless Sultai? Like, how does it work? Where did it come from? And like, what does it do?
So the first versions of the deck I saw were built by Brian DeMars, and he had just like Shardless Agent, Tarmogoyf, and Counterbalance top. And it was just like this weird, it was called Bug back then. It wasn't called Sultai. But then like Deathrite Shaman came out, and I just, Shardless Agent is just like one of my favorite cards. And I started working with that and Deathrite Shaman. And it was the deck I built like a week before one of the invitationals. And then I just started tuning it. And eventually I just won an invitational with it. So I think that I definitely did come up with the idea of the deck, but I definitely tuned it to the point where it is now. Like, most people's lists are very similar to the one that I started playing years ago. But it's basically a mid-range deck, so if you've ever played anything like Jund or something similar, that's basically it. You just like slowly accrue card advantage and just kind of kill them with what you have left over. Most of the early game is spent just kind of trying to keep them off tempo a little bit with maybe some discard spells, some counter spells, some removal. And then you just end up with like a Tarmogoyf or maybe like a Shardless Agent and a Creeping Tar Pit, and you just kind of clean it up from there.
Right. So like you said, it's a mid-range deck. I've played against it a lot. I've never actually played the deck myself, but when I have to describe it to people, I say it's the deck that will have, like, outside of a ridiculous Omniscience combo or something, it is the deck that will have more cards than any other. Like, it just 2-for-1s or 3-for-1s or whatever till you're dead. Like, you just run out of advantage after a while. You can't get ahead of them on cards.
Yeah, most of the time, like, the deck is just grinding people out, but sometimes it is just like against combo, for example, you can't really grind them into nothing unless you just draw like a bunch of Hymn to Toroks or whatever. It's just like, all right, I'm going to Thoughtseize you. Okay, take a piece of your combo, and then hopefully just try and like put a little pressure on you, maybe have a counter spell towards the end of the game, and then that's it. But against the other blue decks, this deck just kind of goes over the top of them with Ancestral Vision and Shardless Agent and stuff. So I like this deck a lot in blue mirrors, which for a while, that was basically all Legacy was.
Right. So you sort of alluded to this, but in Legacy, what does the Shardless deck look like? What are the key spells, and why are they important to the deck?
Deathrite Shaman is the most important one. If that card didn't exist, I don't think this deck would exist, because without it, you wouldn't be able to play as many 3-mana cards in your Legacy deck because of things like Daze, Stifle, Wasteland. So Deathrite Shaman helps you a lot there. And Shardless Agent is kind of what gives you all the card advantage, and it is important because you're playing expensive playing other things like Daze or Spell Pierce or things that are just bad cascades. So the fact that you play Shardless Agent over all these other Legacy staples is very telling that this card is very powerful, and it seems kind of innocuous just because it's only a 2/2, but it just ends up where you have a Shardless Agent and either another Shardless Agent or a Deathrite Shaman or something that allows you to double block a Noble Mongoose, and you have these little creatures flying around that both protect your Planeswalkers and attack your opponent's Planeswalkers. So I don't think it's fair to look at just Shardless Agent as just a 2/2 body and think like, yeah, you're up a card, right? But it's like not a real card. But it does all add up and it all matters, and that's kind of what the deck is built around. So Tarmogoyf is kind of the brick wall. It stops a lot of things from attacking you on the ground and then will eventually kill your opponent. But most of the time, Tarmogoyf is just kind of like a removal spell for a Nimble Mongoose. Mm-hmm. And then Ancestral Vision is also a very important card, but I think people overvalue its importance. Like, I see a lot of people picking up the deck for the first time, and they try and set up a Brainstorm, put the Ancestral Vision back on top, and then Shardless Agent to cascade into it. But that's a play that I ever rarely make, actually, because it just ends up costing you so much tempo just to draw 3 cards, and then, yeah, you're up a bunch of cards, but you're behind on the board a lot. So like you can certainly do that in a lot of games, and that's really powerful, especially if you're just playing against a deck that's not really doing anything, something like Miracles, for example. But most of the time, it's just like, I'm going to cast my Shardless Agent to get on the board and hopefully hit a removal spell or maybe a discard spell. And if I hit Ancestral, cool. But that's not something that I'm actively trying to set up. But Ancestral is the card that allows you to go toe-to-toe in these blue mirrors and just beat them on card advantage alone, because you have cards like Abrupt Decay and Maelstrom Pulse that allow you to answer like very specific permanents that not a lot of decks have answers to. So like Anumizawa's Jitte, for example, might just get out of control if you're playing like a Jeskai deck. But with this deck, you can basically kill everything that they play. So just having some hard card drawing is really important. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess Abrupt Decay is another big one. It makes it so your counterbalance matchup's very good. It does deal with just random permanents. And then there are just some Planeswalkers on the top end. Sometimes Jace, sometimes Liliana of the Veil.
Right. So yeah, those a lot of those the signature spells, Tarmogoyf, maybe a little less, especially nowadays. But Abrupt Decay and Deathrite Shaman, those I feel like in a lot of ways have sort of become like the core of any black-green or rock style deck, and this is obviously no different.
Yep, absolutely.
They're just sort of the linchpin of surviving against decks like Miracles, which I think without them would really just be the top dog. And it might be the top dog anyway, but it's what gives all these other decks, the rock style decks, a fighting chance.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've alluded to this too, but the Shardless deck, how does it win? Like, there's no specific pattern, obviously. You have a ton of different creatures, but the ultimate game plan, would you say it's just to like wear them down, make some threat stick after you've sort of exhausted the resources, and that will do it? Like, there's no specific game plan, more just like a general approach?
Pretty much. There's no like Entreat the Angels or anything like that. There's no big flashy win condition. Tarmogoyf is certainly the most powerful win condition you have in the deck, but you know, that's also the card that people try and kill the most often because it's so scary. So a lot of times it's just like, well, I have the Shardless Agent left over, I had a Creeping Tar Pit that I played a little bit earlier, you kind of ran out of stuff to do, but your opponent's out of resources, so you just start attacking them for 5 and maybe draining them with Deathrite Shaman. And it is very much looking for a spot where you can turn the corner and start hitting them just like for 1 and 2, just like these little chip shots, soften them up a little bit, and then eventually get through for like the last points of damage. But there's never like one turn where you just like lock it up and then you can no longer lose and stuff like that. It is very much like this very scrappy end game where you're just kind of using your kind of pathetic creatures to beat them down.
Hey, whatever gets the job done, right?
Yeah.
So are there other variants of Shardless? Like there's sort of the traditional build like you described, where it's got the Hymn to Torox, the Thought Seizes maybe, and then Ancestral Visions, the whole host of creatures. But like, are there other versions that splash colors or have something different? And if they are, like, how did people get to those versions? Like, what variants have we seen, and how did they shape the current version?
So the big 2 versions, I would say, are the ones that have 4 Force of Will, 4 Baleful Strix, and very little discard, if any. And then the other flip side of things is 0 Force of Wills and a bunch of discard. And either of these can splash Meddling Mage in the sideboard. I think that's like the main innovation that online players have done, but I'm not a huge fan of that. I played around with those decks a little bit, but it's like it's not the deck I built. You know, it doesn't feel the same to me. You know, it's like I built my deck this way for a reason, and I don't feel like those really help all that much, because I think you want the combination of discard and counter spells, and that is kind of what gives you the best chance against combo. But some people are just like, well, you can't really beat combo in game 1, so why even try? Just like have 10 cards in your sideboard for it. and just play this really robust deck that's actually just really good against like all the Delver decks, all the other blue mid-range decks, and so on and so forth. But the way I built my deck, I think I can beat everything, or I at least have a chance against everything.
Okay, so I guess that leads us into our next question: is why do you choose to play Shardless? Is it, what makes it so appealing to you?
Well, aside from the nice, warm, fuzzy feeling of feeling like you have a chance in any matchup, it's infinitely customizable. Like you can change the deck to prey on whatever sorts of decks you expect to some degree. Most of the time, I'm talking about like just beating the other blue decks. Like you're naturally good against Miracles because of Abrupt Decay. You're pretty much naturally good against Stoneforge Mystic decks because of all the discard, and then you're good against Delver decks because this deck plays more lands than most of the blue decks, or at least more mana sources. And you have good answers to Nimble Mongoose and Delver of Sea. Then if something specific pops up, like, oh, people are playing like True Name Nemesis again or whatever, it's like, okay, well, black has a lot of good, maybe sideboard or even main deck answers to those cards like Toxic Deluge, Knight of Soul's Betrayal, Gugari Charm, whatever. And week to week, my deck would change based on what kind of cards people were playing, because I would want to tailor my deck specifically to attack them, just because this is more of a reactive sort of control style mid-range deck than something like, I don't know, Abzan, where it's more of a proactive deck. It's just like, well, I don't need to answer your stuff specifically because I'm just going to like play these Siege Rhinos and these Elspeths and beat you that way. This deck doesn't really have anything on that power level, so you do need specific answers. So this deck rewards you for knowing the metagame really well.
Okay, so I was just about to ask, what decks do you think Shardless is best against, although it sounds like that's somewhat malleable.
It is, absolutely. I mean, you can pick and choose like what decks maybe you even just want to lose to because you don't think they're going to show up, or maybe you have like buys in a Grand Prix or something and you don't think that like Burn is going to be in your bracket, for example.
Right.
But yeah, Burn is a bad matchup. Price of Progress is brutal against this deck, and also Burn just interacts in such a way where like a lot of your cards don't interact with them, because like Abrupt Decay is a little too slow. Shardless Agent into Ancestral just kind of doesn't really matter against them. Force of Will is fine, but it's not like the be-all, end-all. And Hymn to Torok is very good, but also a lot of your creatures like Deathrite Shaman just get lit up by a Searing Blaze. So it's really hard to get any traction against them and actually stick a clock.
All right, so Burn is obviously one bad matchup. Are there others? How about decks like Lands or some of the others? Did you have like not unwinnable, but just like really rough matchups?
Yeah, Burn is the one that is just rough just because their deck lines up so well against yours. And there are things you can do, like you can just play a bunch of chills if you want to beat Burn, but even then you're not a lock. And then for the most part, it's just like in any given tournament, I probably won't be able to beat all of these decks, but I will probably be able to beat some, which is like Death and Taxes, Sneak and Show, Lands is another good example. Storm is pretty tough if the opponent is very competent. And it's tough to beat all of those decks because they all require different cards to be good against them. There's no like one thing that you can play that will just have a good matchup against all those decks. So just the diversity of Legacy is kind of the killer for this deck.
Yeah, and I guess that's true for most decks in Legacy, is they all have their Achilles heel, or the type of deck that they just like they can't beat, or they have such an abysmal matchup it's not really worth losing sleep over.
Right.
So, well, now if Shardless happens to be a bad matchup for a deck, what can they do to fight back? Like, what are some good sideboard cards against Shardless Sultai?
So I think the main thing is to realize what your role is in the matchup. So like Esper Deathblade against Shardless was kind of a popular matchup, at least during the invitationals when I had built this deck and was like, I refined it to the point of where it is now, basically. Like, I think I had a really good version at that point, and at that point, Deathblade was really popular. And I felt like a lot of people just had a role misassignment. Like, they didn't really know what they were supposed to be doing in the matchup. So they would bring in things like Supreme Verdict, which, if I had access to, I would bring it against them, right? It's just like, I have all of the late game stuff. I have the Ancestrals, and they're trying to play this control game against me where I just have them dominated. So it's not that, their best bet is to just like stick with their game plan, figure out how they can actually use their aggression to their advantage, and like what type of aggressive style cards would be good against Shardless, instead of just like, oh, well, the games I lose, he has like 2 Death Rights of Tarmogoyf for Shardless Agent, and a Supreme Verdict would be good. So for that matchup specifically, I don't think there's anything that they can necessarily bring in that's just like a haymaker against me. Like if you're playing like an Esper Deathblade deck, or just an Esper Stone deck, like no Death Right Shamans, like something in the style of Joe Bernal, like you could play something like Back to Basics along with like 4 or 5 islands, and that sort of thing is pretty potent against Shardless, even though they do have something like Abrupt Decay. Like you just have to give them enough Abrupt Decay targets that you can stick something like that and just make it so they can't cast spells anymore, Other than that, Miracles, I think now they're kind of figuring out what sort of things Shardless is bringing in against them. Like they bring in Wear and Tear in the Dark in anticipation of like Null Rod and Pithing Needle and stuff. They want to keep their Sensei's Divining Tops live, and a lot of people just board out counterbalances to try and blank the Abrupt Decays, and they'll have more threats, just like more Jaces, maybe more Entreats. Monastery Mentor is also kind of good if you want to just overload the Abrupt Decays. And it's stuff like that. It's just like try and trick me in sideboarding and have a card in your deck that is good against the way that I sideboard. So there's just nothing specific that you can really bring in outside of like Price of Progress if you're a Delver deck.
Yeah, I guess one that I know, at least a lot of the guys I played with, they always try and figure a way to get it into their deck if they can, is Blood Moon, because the deck is somewhat restricted on how many basics it can afford to play, and fetching them is also like sort of a restriction in and of itself, since you need like double black and access to blue early and all that. So I feel like Blood Moon's a decent card at least. How about something like Rest in Peace? Is that any good? Because I know you're somewhat graveyard dependent, but not like exclusively. It's not an all-in deck.
Right. I mean, you have Deathrite Shaman and Tarmogoyf, which are 2 of your big... The thing about boarding in these cards is that I kind of want to just keep in my Abrupt Decays, even if my opponent like showed me that they were siding out Counterbalance because of things like this.
Right.
So Blood Moon, you can play around because your Miracles opponent isn't necessarily threatening you, Like, you can afford to just, like, play it a little bit slower and hold open Abrupt Decay mana so you don't get KO'd by a Blood Moon. So I don't even feel like that type of stuff is all that effective, just because you're kind of walking into the cards that they already have access to in their deck. So maybe if you catch them with their pants down, then yeah, Blood Moon's going to be good, but it's still pretty tough. As for Rest in Peace, I generally side out some number of Tarmogoyfs against Miracles just because I don't really want the clock. I just want to like grind them out, and that plan is actually viable, and I'll just kill them eventually with like a Tar Pit and a Death Right. And I certainly don't want to overextend into Terminus either. Right.
Yeah, so I guess like you said earlier, probably the best plan is just to be the best version of what you are, because you can't outgrind them. You can't like beat them at their own game. And I mean, that's sort of just sideboarding strategy in general, right? Is don't try and do what your opponent does better than him, because that's what he does. You should do what your deck does, and if you can get them, like if you have some like, silver bullet, sure, but otherwise don't go over the deep end trying to beat them at their own game, or trying to like come up with some crazy strategy or whatever.
Absolutely. I aside from that, I just think like trying to bring in something that I'm not prepared for is probably a good way to do it. Like, Elspeth Knight Errant, might be a card that like I'll lose to on occasion, just because it's like, all right, I have the game kind of locked up, like I'll spend my counter spell on like this or whatever, and then I can tap out this turn because I can't think of a card that would punish me for doing this, and then you like play an Elspeth or something. It's just like, oh, okay, I can't beat that card.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Armageddon, I guess, is like another thing where it's like, oh.
I wasn't playing around that one, huh? All right. So, why should someone who's not playing Shardless currently, or who's new to Legacy, why should they consider Shardless as like the deck for them? Like, what type of player do you recommend it to?
Anyone who has played with Jund and cast the card Brainstorm, I think is just like the exact combination. Like if you've played Jund before, you'd probably be very familiar with your game plan as a Shardless player against a lot of the decks in the format. But the wrench is that now you have Brainstorm in your deck, which is very difficult to cast correctly if you haven't before. I don't know if you've done a podcast on just Brainstorm specifically. But
no, although that will be sometime in the future.
Okay.
That's one of those topics that like I think anybody who wants to talk Legacy at some point, they either have to learn how to play with it or how to play against it, and you probably should learn how to play with it no matter what you do, because like it's the best card in the format, so like there's a lot that can be said about it.
Yeah, so despite that, I still think that you could just pick up the deck kind of cold and just figure out what's going on. And even if your brainstorms aren't 100% perfect or whatever, like it still won't affect you that much. Like the best way for you to learn how to cast brainstorm is to actually cast it, and actually just get the reps in and do some practice.
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding a little condescending, which I'm not, I'm just, I have said in the past that I think a lot of people, they lean towards playing Shardless when they're newer to the format. It's either Shardless or one of the Delver variants. They lean towards those because they are the decks that are the most natural. Like they're the most like a standard deck. Like they don't have the incredibly busted cards or the super intricate combo pieces. It's just like plain card advantage, exactly how you expected. These are big dumb creatures. They do exactly what they do in other formats. They're just more efficient here. But it's not like a deck like Storm where it's like a million different pieces that you really have to understand how they work. Like you can pick up Shardless or like a Delver deck, and you can run it with some confidence that you at least know how these cards work or how they should work.
Right. Those decks are playing Magic, whereas like Storm and Dredge, you're just like playing a different game.
Right. Yeah, and even some of the other, like I play Infect a lot, and even that has moments where you're like, man, this is really unfair. Like what I just did is not how Magic was intended to be played. Like I'm playing these terrible little creatures, but they win so incredibly fast or so unfairly that like that's not what Shardless does. Shardless is like everything's honest. There's no lying. There's no cheating. This is all exactly how you think it should work.
Yep, exactly.
So given that, would you say that there's a high skill barrier to playing Shardless, or is it a relatively low like entry? Well, obviously there's a high skill barrier to playing Legacy, period. But the specific the Shardless Sultai deck, is it easier to get into and to learn how to play? And should that play into a person's decision like to pick it up?
Potentially. I think the deck is pretty simple to play once you kind of get the feel for like how the matchups play out themselves and what you're trying to do. Like the one big secret to playing the deck that I don't see a lot of people actually doing is just make sure you figure out a way to use your mana every turn. Mm-hmm. Like every time you end a turn with like 1 or 2 mana unspent, like you've probably done something wrong, because that's the best way for you to both like keep up with your opponent and also turn the corner against them. So yeah, just try and make sure you're doing that. Just be as mana efficient as possible. Try and be actively thinking about like, okay, what am I trying to do here? Like, should I spend my turn like actually killing this thing, or like maybe can I develop my board, play a Tarmogoyf, and like start attacking them? And once you figure that stuff out, it's all pretty simple.
Okay, so you've got a lot of experience playing the deck, obviously. So tell us about one of your favorite moments playing Shardless Sultai. Like, how did it happen? What did you do? And why is it so special? Why is that the moment?
I think the kind of defining moment was when I was in top 8 of the Invitational with it, and it was like, all right, this is awesome. This is like a deck that I built in Legacy, and like new decks don't get created in Legacy very often, no, and they're certainly not like proven to be good and become like format staples. So like it's still kind of surreal to me that a deck I built is like actually playable in Legacy, because it's so difficult. But I'm playing in top 8 against Sneak and Show, and it's traditionally not a very good matchup, but it's like, I know I can get them, right? Mm-hmm. I have sort of the tools. I have some discard. I have some counter spells. I kind of have a clock. And I get attacked with an Emrakul, and I think I had to block with a Baleful Strix.
Yes.
To like not die or whatever. So I just like lost my board, but then maybe I kept one thing. I don't remember. But like then I won, which is insane. It's like so hard to win from that point. You have no permanents. They have a sneak attack in play that's just there threatening to kill you at any point. And I actually won that game, and then won the match, won the tournament, and it was like, yeah.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, so speaking of the Star City Game Invitational, that was the one in Atlanta in 2013, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So when you won, you got to make a token, like all of the Invitational winners get to now, and you chose to make the avatar, the Merit Lage avatar token from Dark Depths. So why'd you choose that token? And what is winning that Invitational and getting to be represented on that token mean to you?
Well, it's the biggest token, right?
It sure is.
So it just makes sense. But even aside from that, like when I've taken a few breaks from Magic, and one of the times I came back, I tuned this Dark Depths deck and extended, and it was kind of similar to Eldrazi actually, with like how popular it was and how often it made top 8 and how often it won the tournaments and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the deck showed up at the Pro Tour a few months earlier, but the versions were like kind of rough, and I just like came back a couple days later. I was like, oh, what kind of Magic tournaments can I play in? Oh, there's a PTQ. I'll play in that. And so I just like worked on the deck a little bit, got third in one of the PTQs. 2 days later, there's another one. I tuned my deck even further, and I got first. And then it was just like the deck of that season. And it was just like this Dark Depths combo deck, you know? And killing people with 2020s was always really fun. And I think people associated Dark Depths with me, so it was just kind of natural.
Awesome. No, that's really cool. I've talked to a few other invitational winners and stuff, and they sort of always have the same thing. They're like, this was the thing that was iconic of me, and they've got the backstory. So that's really great to hear it firsthand.
Yep. Yeah, I think the invitational winners being able to make a token of whatever they want is awesome. It is a sweet prize.
Yeah, no, that's something to be very, very jealous of. And while we're on the topic of things to be jealous of, you had an internship with WotC. That's sort of the opportunity only someone can only dream of, right? So what was your biggest takeaway from the time when you worked there? Like, how has that shaped you as a person and your Magic career going forward?
I realized that I was not as smart as I thought I was.
Oh, man.
That was about it. And once that got put into perspective, it was like, okay, like everyone around me was just so smart and so good at their job, and I just felt like an amateur.
Yeah, so designing cards not as easy as playing them or tuning decks.
Well, I was just interning for development, not actually design.
Okay.
Yeah, I know for a fact that I'm not great at designing cards. Like, if you were just like, hey, give me a Magic card, I'd just be like, like, I don't know. I don't have like a lot of just like raw ideas floating around. But if you're like, hey, what is wrong with this Magic card for like any number of reasons, like I think I'm actually okay at that. And with time, I could be potentially good at that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, development was a lot of fun. I learned that there are just so many smart people out there, and I'm good at certain things, but I'm certainly not good at everything, and that's just a very valuable lesson. But yeah, it was a ton of fun. I learned a lot, and I ended up leaving basically just because I missed playing Magic.
Okay. Well, speaking of playing Magic, I didn't have this on the agenda originally, but people would be upset if I didn't ask. The Eldrazi deck. You managed to top 8 the last Legacy Open with it in Philadelphia. Is it a real deck? Is it a good deck? And would you play it again? Like, is it the real McCoy? Because there's a lot of questions, especially on the internet, about even based on the results we've seen. Like, is this going to be a lasting thing?
I would say yes to all three. Like, if I had the chance to run that tournament back, I would certainly play the same deck. Like, I would change maybe 20 cards because my deck was super rough. I hadn't practiced with it. I hadn't played any games before the tournament. It was just like kind of inferring things that I knew about the like aggressive Eldrazi archetype and Legacy in general, and I built my deck going from that. Mm-hmm. Once I actually played out the games in certain matchups, like Lands and Miracles were two where I was just like, oh, I was not prepared for this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think the deck is real. I mean, like, Chalice is so good against so many decks in the format, and Thought-Knot Seer is also just very, very good, especially when you're just casting it on turn 2. And then, some of the mediocre stuff, like the Reality Smashers and the Mana Reshapers, are very impressive in certain matchups. And I think, the deck has a pretty powerful, aggressive curve. It has disruption pieces. It has good removal. It has like fast mana, like more fast mana than really any other deck in the format, at least on a consistent basis, Mm-hmm. And you can make whatever work. Like even in like this colorless shell, you have enough different sideboard cards that you could actually fight against whatever sort of deck you expect. So I do think the deck is definitely a contender.
Well, there you heard it from the source, folks. The man who top 8'd and almost took it the whole way. Eldrazi's a real deck. Well, anyway, Gerry, I've had a blast talking with you. So thank you for joining us today and giving us a little bit of your expertise and your experience with Shardless Sultai.
Right on.
And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode of Legacies Allure. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and feel free to leave us feedback on our YouTube page. Or you can message me directly at mtgtraininggrounds@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook at the user mtgtraininggrounds, or follow us on Twitter at @mtg_trgrounds. Once again, I'm Zachary Tuck, your host for Legacy Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds. Thank you for joining us.